Welcome to a Walking Writers Salon from Walk, Listen, Create. And we're really pleased and delighted to have Peter Finch as our guest this evening. He's a poet, chronicler, and literary entrepreneur. And this year alone, just to give you a chance to think about this, he has 4 new books published and 2 reprints. And he's here to discuss his approach to writing as much as he is to talk about his new book, Edging the City, which is published by Seren Books. And Seren Books have very graciously pitched in a couple of ebook copies for our multiple choice quiz this evening, which will take place at the drawing to the end of the event. So those of you who are new to salons, and new to Walk, Listen, Create, we've been set up 2 to 3 years now. We're a social enterprise registered in Belgium within the EU. And there are 3 of us involved. That's Babak, who's on this call, Hert Vermeer, and myself. And what we've tried to do is create a network and community supporting artists, composers, performers, and writers who create work on foot or about walking. And we've got an ongoing project called Shorelines. If you want to chip in and submit short pieces, we encourage you to do that and to read them aloud. It's all possible to do it. You can find that on the website. And we've just appointed a poet and writer in residence for 2022-3. And as we speak, we have a sound artist just finishing up a soundwalk residency we offered in Catalonia. Okay, so as we say, it's about the salon is about finding out about our guests' approach to writing, walking, and the topics they might be writing about. Peter and I will chat for about 20 minutes. We'll open up to your questions. If you've got questions ahead of this, if you can just put them in the chat, we'll invite you to say them. And read them out if you don't wish to say them. So if you have mic problems or something like that, we'll be happy to read them out. I'll be watching the chat. Let me introduce Peter Finch. Peter is a full-time poet, psychogeographer, critic, author, rock fan, and literary entrepreneur living in Cardiff. Until 2011, he was Chief Executive of Literature Wales, formerly the Welsh Academy, the Welsh National Literature Development Agency. As a writer, he works in both traditional and experimental forms. He's best known for his boundary pushing, his declamatory poetry readings, his creative work based on his native city of Cardiff, and his editing of Seren's Reels series, and his knowledge of rock and roll. He's currently working with the urban photographer John Briggs on a rediscovery of the South Wales hinterland, Walking the Valleys, due for publication at the end of the year, and Edging the City, a psychogeographic ramble around the capital's 50-mile boundary, which we're going to discuss this evening. He also has a book called Walking Cardiff, which was published by Seren Books in 2019. His 2-volume 1,000-page of collected poems appeared from Seren in May this year. His DIY punk handmade chapbook of 2022 poetry, Just When You Think It's Over, It Starts Again, appeared in a limited edition from New Jersey's Between the Shadows Press in 2022. Now, I have to thank a character called Nathan Munday, who was a shortlisted writer in one of our writing competitions, who suggested Peter as a guest. I have to be honest, I hadn't come across Peter before, and I feel rather embarrassed that my view of psychogeography has been so insular, perhaps too London-centric. Anyway, Peter's range and the depth of knowledge about Cardiff is phenomenal, but what really draws one to this book is his writing style. He's got a huge and rich vocabulary in the best sense, and it's hard to put this book down. So perhaps I shouldn't have expected anything less from a man with such a extraordinary CV and experience. Anyway, so maybe we might start a discussion on how you came to write this book and the style that you adopted.
How I came to write it? Well, COVID has brought an awful lot of ill uh, to these islands. But in some cases, in some respects, there are things that are positive, and I think this was one of the positive things. The book came about in trying to find ways around COVID regulations. And one of the COVID regulations that was issued, we had slightly different regulations in Wales than in England, and they came in at different times, but nevertheless they formed the same pattern. And this one was what I thought was amazingly presumptuous announcement that we could no longer go anywhere other than inside the area of our own local authority. And I can remember driving up the road and suddenly realizing I'd driven over the Cardiff boundary. There weren't any guards there. And suddenly I was in the next authority, heading up the valleys, turned round and came back. So one of the things I thought I could do is take advantage of this and walk around the border or explore the border of Cardiff, of the city that I live in. And I got to know a runner, an ultra runner. My daughter is an ultra runner. Ollie Smith, a surveyor who lives about 4 miles just south of the border in the north of Cardiff, decided he was going to try and run the whole border, which is run about 50 miles all the way round, in one go. And this is what he did. And I was amazed at this. We had Zoom conversations because you couldn't meet anyone in person at that time. He showed me maps. Then the great day came. It was in November, pretty similar date to the one that we're in at the moment, pretty similar time of the year. And Ollie ran round the border and then reported back. And his tale was, I thought, so interesting that things had not been anything like he'd imagined they'd be, or I imagined they would be. I thought I need to try and do this in more detail, to have a look at the border and see what I can encounter. So that's how I came to write the book. Of course, it didn't start off as a book. I didn't think I am going to write a book. I thought I am going to walk around the border, or initially I am going to walk around some of the border. And these things grow and roll into each other, don't they?
Well, okay, so I mean that gives us a sort of hint then, what did you think you were doing at the beginning? Did you imagine you were going to start off and write poetry, or was it
Well, I
just
thought initially I thought, perhaps I can go and have a look at some of the areas of the city right out by the border, which I don't know. Now, I'm a native Cardiffian, born and bred here. My accent, by the way, is not the native accent. There is a native Cardiff accent, and I'm not speaking in that register at the moment. Perhaps that's something that we could move to later on, discussion of. But I wanted to try bits I didn't know. And those bits were so exciting. I went back and looked at a map and thought, I've got to make more of this.
Okay, so what kind of preparation do you do before you set out?
Well, the initial exercise is maps. Always maps. I've enjoyed maps all my life. I like reading maps like you can read a book. I can sit with a map, as long as it's detailed enough. And the OS are very thorough in this respect. Sit and enjoy looking at the map. And I've discovered over time that it's possible to get now increasingly easy access to not only the contemporary map, but the whole gamut, the whole run of historical maps, going right back through time till about 1840. And you can see how any district has changed over that period. So the initial exercise before going out and walking anywhere is to get together the maps, study the maps, see how the landscape's changed, if it has. Find out what was there, isn't there now. Work out whether there are things you want to go and look at. And only then do I then start to think of the practicalities. Okay, I'm going to do this. How am I going to do it? How do I get to the beginning? How do I get to the end? And I started with the notion that I would walk in a series of circles. But that went out the window, and I talked about it with Sue. And we came to the conclusion that it would be a lot easier if we did this by taking 2 cars. parking each end of the chosen section of the route, and then driving back to where you started, so you could knit the whole thing together. And we also talked about whatever came out of this. How was this going to be? Was this going to be a we, or was this going to be an I? And concluded in the end that it would be an I. And you read the book, and it appears that I'm there on my own.
Do you talk about walking with a couple of other people, a couple of poets and things? But I'm never quite sure whether that's about this walk, or you're relating something that you've done before, because you've walked so many different parts of Cardiff in so many different ways and written about it.
Yes, the history of these works goes back to 2002, 2001, when the editor of an international magazine out of the University of Aberystwyth contacted me and said there have been a lot of changes in Cardiff, capital of Wales. Do you think you could go out and write about them for us? And I thought, well, if changes in the city can be seen from Aberystwyth, then they must be going on, and I need to find out about them. I thought I knew the city backwards, and I went out to rediscover it and found I absolutely didn't. And there were completely new things. And in the process of exploring these new things and writing the initial article, I came up with the idea that wouldn't it be good if, don't forget we're 2001 we're talking about, 2002, wouldn't it be good if I set this up as a giant website and we had links, that you had a central piece, and as you found interesting things, you clicked on them and it took them to other pieces of text, other descriptions, other jumping off points, poems, etc., all of which I would knit together and I would create. And this really hadn't been tried, not in that way. But this soon rolled together and became a book. And it became a book which I called Real Cardiff. This is where the Cardiff accent comes in. Why is it called Real Cardiff? Because it's real Cardiff, and it's also real Cardiff, like, see, isn't it? It's the two things, which was a local joke that worked very well. The local press liked that. And the book took off and sold phenomenally well. Jan Morris, who I knew, but I didn't know all that well, said some extremely kind things about it. And I thought, well, I must be onto a winner here. Let's push on. And that turned into further adventures, even more adventures. And it ended up with 4 volumes I've written of Real Cardiff. And it spun off a series which I edit, all of which are books using the same approach to the Real series, which visits, first of all, conurbations and other areas of Wales, but now expanded to include Real Oxford, Real Cambridge, Real Glasgow, Real Bloomsbury, Real Chester, Real Bristol. There's a whole run of them, about 25 volumes, I think. So the idea must have worked.
So you're becoming like the Arthur Mee. Wasn't that Arthur Mee who wrote that topographical studies of Britain? But yeah, no, okay. Well, I mean, what also intrigued me about your writing style was that, I mean, you obviously have a fabulous vocabulary, and you can draw on some really lovely expressions and things. But what was I was intrigued about, because the sentence length is actually very short. And I wondered whether there was something that you'd actually sort of decided at the beginning, I'm going to make this sort of kind of short and punchy, or whether there was something more that you discovered. And I'm also intrigued about whether the pace at which you walked was linked to the pace at which the book was written, or how the style was written, and whether that's something that you've found, that walking and writing, there's a link.
Let's answer the second part of that first. The walking and writing, is there a link? When I was a young man, and I'd never been walking in the countryside, I was city born. We didn't do it. My family in those days, families did not go walking. You didn't do it. My mother had a pair of court shoes. My father had a pair of thin leather shoes that he wore to the office. He didn't have kit and go out in the countryside, so I didn't know what it was like. When I discovered it, I was taken by a friend to the Brecon Beacons. Brecon Beacons are a range of low hills, well, on the edge of being mountains, 2,000, 3,000 feet maximum, which is high enough. It's high enough to get cloud cover. And I was taken there and discovered suddenly when the cloud lifted one day that there was the distance between you and the sky had somehow simultaneously decreased and increased. It had decreased because you could almost touch it spiritually, and it had increased because suddenly the sky was absolutely enormous. It was the biggest thing you'd ever seen. And these two things together were absolutely thrilling to the core and made me think I have to discover a way of writing about this. And everything has stemmed from that. All of the walking that I've done, all of the writing goes back to that original core experience. Trying to find ways of writing about things which I had never done before, which I'd never read others doing, or I hadn't read widely enough to encounter that, perhaps. So that was one part of the origin of all this. The second part, you asked specifically about sentence length. I think that goes back to the web origin of this, because the whole trick with writing for the web, people don't think of it as the web now. I mean, what an old-fashioned word to use. It's incredibly old-fashioned. But when originally you had to teach people, journalists who wrote for newspapers, you have to write in a different way if you're writing online, because people's attention span is shorter, the screens flicker and move around, so your sentences need to be shorter. And I think it comes from that. Also, one of the people, the writers I'd always admired when I was starting out was Ernest Hemingway, and Hemingway is famous for his staccato short sentences, which speed the narrative along. They speed it up.
Okay, well, I mean, here you're not writing poetry, but forgive me, but have you written a lot of poetry about Cardiff and interpreting the place? I mean, and which do you find more comfortable around? Do you feel to interpret places more attuned to writing poetry or to writing a narrative in prose?
One of the things that I've been interested in most of my creative life has been breaking down the boundaries between things, in particular the boundary between poetry allegedly over here on the left hand and prose over here somewhere on the right. Somehow the right hand is regarded as safe, sane and correct, and the left hand is wild, progressive and liberal and all of those things. Never the twain shall meet, but actually the twain shall meet. These two things will come together. In the early Real Cardiff books, and right the way through as a thread through my writing career in this particular sphere, I tried to draw the two together to not distinguish between the prose paragraph, which is describing the history in a more conventional sense of something, then turns into some kind of reaction of mine to what I'm seeing, which I choose to write out in a more staccato poetry form. I don't announce that, I just put it in there, and on we roll. And sometimes the writing is done to particular rules. Let's see if this is a town that has lots of pubs. Let's see what we can make of the names of the breweries and the names of the pubs. How can we roll this together as a central piece to the writing, which will distinguish this a little bit, perhaps, from conventional travel writing.
No, well, that's really interesting. I mean, the other thing with this is that you took photographs and you used them as a kind of aid memoir. Am I right?
You're right, yeah.
And then what I'm intrigued by is after each walk, did you come back and just write straight away, or did you leave it and then sort of set aside a month to do the writing or 3 months to do the writing?
Well, again, let's take those. In reverse order. The gap between the experience and the writing needs to be as absolutely short as it conceivably can be. If you don't write your impressions down, your observations down, your collected inspirations down immediately, by the time you get to write them down, they will have changed. They will have changed by the time that's occurred in between the experience and the writing of it, which will have had an influence. The mind will embellish, it will forget, it will enhance, it will do all sorts of things to whatever the experience you're trying to record is. Yeah, that's fine, but if you lose the initial experience, then you could be you could be in difficulty. So my practice with the camera, I discovered that I always carry a notebook, old-fashioned notebook and pen. I've tried all the methods. I've tried in the early days before iPhones. I used to ring up the home answer phone system and dictate what I was thinking from my early Nokia onto this little tape that was whirring in the hall at home, because it was tipping down with rain and I couldn't write on my pad because the ink would run. I've done that kind of thing. I've tried using the speech to text facility on a smartphone, and found that its comic results really ought to be abandoned. It's the breathing that you do, it interprets that as well. So if you're going down a hill and you happen, or up a hill, and you happen to, as you climb, it'll turn that into a word or mishear something. So that didn't work. So I concluded in the end that I had to take as many photographs as I could, so I would carry a decent camera with me. I'd also take a phone camera, and I just keep photographing things. Photograph what you saw, what I saw, and then get back home, download the photographs, look at the photograph, try and write up the notes before beginning work. The notes were never the piece. The notes were the notes for the reasons I've just explained.
And do you do copious drafts, or are you someone who can take your notes and then spill out the writing there and then?
Well, Allen Ginsberg said, "First thoughts, best thoughts," and sometimes he was right, but an awful lot of times he was wrong. No, I write and rewrite, and some of the pieces in the edging. There's the book, edging the city. Some of the pieces in there might have had 20, 24 versions. Others considerably less, and sometimes you're lucky and it comes out better than it might have done, and you don't have to do so many versions. But usually there are a lot of versions of things, a lot of abandoning, and of course you find out more things as you go along. In working on this, you don't just go round the route once. You go back and you check out things that you missed, or you've done a section which was really exciting, and then you look up some of the references and find, God, so and so was nearby. I need to go back and look at that. So you go back and re-experience it. This is great. The difficulty comes when you're walking clockwise, because this walk was a clockwise perambulation around the périphérique of Cardiff. Was if you do things in reverse. You go back and for some reason or other end up walking the wrong way. Trying to knit those two together has been difficult.
Well, I have to say I know exactly what you're saying, because I did a sound walk. I was commissioned to do a sound walk from the highest point in the borough of Greenwich to the lowest point. And I foolishly tried to do it by coming into the middle kind of thing, and it didn't work. It was horrendous. And I was working editing sound. I wasn't editing words, but And to be absolutely honest, I think, who hasn't really had the desire to walk around the boundary of one's territory, and so I can really see that, and certainly for me, I mean, it's always been a sort of fascinating thing as I've sort of made more and more efforts of trying to work out the boundaries of places and walk them, and I was very fortunate. When we first moved to Greenwich, I was commissioned by the borough to devise 150 walking and cycling routes which linked health centres in the borough. But I was told that I wasn't allowed to create a route that went over the borough boundary. I became very aware of where the boundary was because I couldn't, I had to keep my routes within the borough boundary. It was pretty absurd, but they didn't want to spend money in a neighbouring borough. So while doing that, I sort of had to kind of study the borough boundary, and I realised that it's pretty much a marathon in length, so about 25, 26, 27 miles, 40k, and so therefore I actually started to devise a marathon route that followed the boundary of the borough of Greenwich. And you will know as well as I do that these borough boundaries, some of them follow rivers, so half the boundary is in the Thames. An awful lot of it, it's almost completely arbitrary. You think some drunken official has set it up, in the council offices, and it's quite strange. So the boundary you chose, what was the boundary you chose, and how and where did you stray from the boundary, and why? What was the?
Well, because the boundary was the raison d'être of the whole thing, the physicality of the boundary. And I start the book on what's known as the Ferry Road Peninsula in Cardiff. It's in South Cardiff. It's where Cardiff abuts the sea. And there's a river estuary at that point. And the centre of the river estuary is the boundary between the city of Cardiff and the Vale of Glamorgan. And I imagined an art project where we would somehow or other get floating dotted line which would stay where the boundary was, and the art would be in trying to make it stay there, and what would happen to it as the tides moved and the currents came along. So that has its physical manifestation in the maps I was mentioning at the beginning of this conversation, that boundaries appear on maps, but the political boundary, the administrative boundary of a city, doesn't necessarily coincide with what others think of as the boundary, the parish boundary, the traditional town boundary, the town border. These things are sometimes not in the same place. So tracking them was extremely difficult. The reluctance of many map makers to put these boundaries on their maps just made it worse. And which boundary were you? There's a dotted line. Now, where am I? Is this a dotted line? Is it a boundary? Have I crossed over into the other authority? Or is this dotted line actually a footpath? And all of these things happened with the maps. So finding the boundary was difficult. As you've experienced, boundaries accumulate over time. The oldest thing that we know that they're firmly based on is the original parishes, but some boundaries exist from before that time and relate to the Normans and their carving up of the lands, and it is very, very difficult to find precision. You'd think that the council would be able to come along and point to things, but they're extremely reluctant to do this, in my experience. But I did find that, as you suggest, they put the boundary, or they fight over the boundary, in putting it in the place where it's going to cost them the least money. So if there are bridges to maintain, the border will zigzag to either include or avoid the bridge so that it's maintained by the opposing authority.
Well, we're quite lucky in London because the boroughs are differentiated by the colour of the wheelie bin. So you kind of know you're not in Tower Hamlets or you've headed into Hackney, because they have different coloured wheelie bins, and that's pretty much how it kind of works. But anyway, well, we've got a couple of questions in the chat, and what I'd encourage people to do now is that come up with questions, and we sort of open it up to the audience. I could keep asking Peter lots of questions about walking boundaries and circumnavigating things, but we'll go ladies first. Anne, do you want to ask your question that you posted in the chat?
As Andrew said at the beginning, I walked the boundary of Philadelphia. I've done it twice now, which is more than 100 miles of our city, and it's fascinating. I was really interested in you're talking about having done it, been inspired by the COVID restrictions, and I wondered if there was something about those restrictions that made the sense of there being a boundary and what's Cardiff and what's not Cardiff more charged. Did it make you think more about what's on one side versus what's on the other, and what does a border actually mean as you were walking?
It did very much. What does a border mean? But the COVID times were very pointed, because I was aware while walking, or we were aware while walking, particularly in the sections that were furthest from where we live in the city, that we were trespassing in territory that was local to other people. And they would look at us with suspicion. Who are these interlopers? Are they bringing COVID with them? Is there the likelihood that they might be infecting us? Nobody ever said anything, but there were lots of looks, and that was reasonably difficult. The other thing was that the whole of the getting to the border was charged, as you put it, with the fact that COVID was keeping people off the streets. You know, the city had closed down. There was nothing going on. There was no noise. Planes were not flying overhead. It was all silent, or much more silent than it would be otherwise. And this put me in mind of, okay, am I back in the medieval border? Is this what the medieval border would have been like, with this kind of experience, this lack of people, this increase in bird song, this no aeroplanes or anything interloping like that?
Wow, that sounds, both, thank you. That's really fascinating. I hadn't thought about how thinking back on COVID, that even you crossed a border, even though you were sticking to the border of your city, you had crossed a border by going into a different neighborhood, and that. So that already you're an outsider, even though you're trying to stick. Yeah.
Now that outsider thing is quite significant in the whole of this walk, I found. When was I an outsider and when was I not? And I found that there were certain districts of the city where people would not speak to you. Nothing to do with COVID, they just didn't speak to you. And other districts of the city where everybody spoke to you. It's the old business of city dwellers, as Baudelaire pointed out. They don't say hello to the next person they meet on the street, because they have to say hello to everybody, and that is too much, so they say hello to nobody. That's what Baudelaire said. So you get this dispossession, this otherness occurs. Whereas the alternative to that is, if you're in the country and you see somebody, you always talk to them, because you don't know when they might be an enemy from elsewhere, but actually they may be someone who you would want to help, or they would want to help you, or whatever. So you talk to them. So those two things apply in the city as well. Some of the districts, nobody speaks. And you turn up, and some of these, I'd come off the trail with my kit covered in mud, and there'd be a bunch of people on the street, and they'd all turn round as if I was the bandit going into the Wild West saloon. Silence, and everybody would turn around and stare at you, which was unnerving. And then there were other districts where people couldn't have been nicer, and they spent the time of day chatting to you and the rest.
Okay, Bob, do you want to pitch in with your comment, or it's not quite a question, but it becomes a question, I think.
Yeah, will do. Okay. I'm interested in spiritual spaces, and I wondered if psychogeography has anything to say about this. My example, Easter 1971, I carried a 14-foot no parking sign on my head, and I stuffed my clothes with and wrapped iron around my body and everything, around Leicester for 2 weeks as performance art. Now, in 2012, the remains of Richard III were found in a parking lot in Leicester 40 years later. These, for me, are spiritual spaces because of the synchronicity, and it's the way in which performance art works
Yeah.
in terms of synchronicity rather than, materialism. I'm just wondering, what's your reflection on the nature of spiritual spaces, if you have any, and how would you define them?
Well, I think what you say is absolutely correct. That mirrors my own feeling about things. I think places acquire, by various means, some kind of spiritual substance, and that spiritual substance remains no matter what you do to the space. And I discussed this when I was investigating the increase in the number of mosques being built in the city. And I got the guy who was the secretary of the Muslim Council of Wales to take me around, to show me a number of different sorts of mosques, let me talk to the local imams, introduce me, and to explain the practice, the spaces. And we spent a couple of days doing this and got to know each other fairly well. And he was firmly of the belief that places were spiritual. He said the example was where a mosque had taken over a church which had previously been a synagogue. So you got all three in the same site. And he said it is the site that is significant. The fact that the name of the religion has shifted makes little difference. The spirituality of the site is what's important. And he's absolutely right. And I think there are places that accumulate bits of history. Some places have more history than others, you hear, and you think, this is nuts. Everywhere's got the same amount of history, and I don't, in my investigation, leads me to think that that's not the case.
Can I ask you a rock and roll question?
Yeah, go.
My opinion is Gene McDaniels is the greatest singer ever in the history of rock and roll. Who's yours?
Greatest singer ever in rock and roll is Elvis. He's got the
Yeah.
best voice.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that he's necessarily the one that I would listen to all the time. That would be Dion, but I'll stick to Elvis.
Thank you.
As it happens, Bob, you'll find out that I believe on the event page we have a Spotify playlist, which is a playlist of the rock music. And it wasn't just rock music, but the music that you listen to on several of the walks. Is that right?
Yeah, can I say something about that?
Of course, please do. Yeah.
The playlist idea. Music has always been top of my experience. It's always running through my head. So I talk about it in the book. I talk about it on the walk. I think about it, and where that's found its way into the text, I've taken the tracks that relate to that and put them in the playlist. So sometimes I'm imagining what it would be like if we had a country festival in a motorway service station that's otherwise inaccessible by foot. You can only get to it by car. How would that work? And so I'm writing about that. But in the next section, I will actually be playing music in my earbuds as I walk through the forest. For example, there was a section of forest which had been cut down. So all the paths had been destroyed temporarily by the fact that you couldn't see them because all the stumps had been leveled and there was debris everywhere. And I tried to find music to accompany that. And I chose the guitarist Robbie Basho. And Robbie Basho's John Fay style of guitar, primitive Appalachian guitar playing, was absolutely perfect for it. So that's ended up on the playlist as well. And it's written about accordingly in the text of the book.
Well, one of the things that also comes up in the book, which you talk about, is you say history is very malleable. You mentioned that Cardiff and Wales itself has had a fair few a number of people who've created sort of fictitious histories of the city, and then some of these have been absorbed into kind of urban myth and perhaps reproduced and then become almost truths. And I was just intrigued. Do you think that's something that is more so in Cardiff than elsewhere, or do you think that's just something that happens anyway?
I think it's something that happens anyway, but it stems from a practical experience that in one of the early Cardiff books, I wrote about the local lake, Rose Park Lake. Is a long, thin lake which has 5 artificial islands. Well, there are islands at the top, which are inaccessible. And I wrote a piece about Jimi Hendrix when he came to Cardiff on his first ever trip, getting so stoned that he woke up in the morning and found himself on the island in Rose Park Lake and had to stagger through the water to get back to the shore, to get on the tour bus, to get back to his next gig. And I forgot about this, and then 15 years later, the story re-emerges, not with my name attached. This is now reality. And then a plaque gets made, and the plaque gets put on the island. This is where Jimi Hendrix woke in so-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so. And it's complete fabrication. It was invented by me. And there's people all over the place now, they've got different references to this, talking about how this actually happened when it didn't happen because I made it up. And there are other examples. I'm sure you can find them in your own areas if you look.
Everywhere you go. I mean, something else that you talked about, which I've often found too, is that you when you're walking and you encounter all these sort of, I don't know what you call them, peripheral places. I don't know, there's always, cemeteries, crematoria.
Fringe lands.
Yeah, exactly. All those sorts of places. You end up with a kind of landmark in your view, and then you can't rid yourself of that landmark. It sort of kind of ends up following you around the city rather than you following it.
Yeah.
And I always remember that sort of, I think it was Derek and Clive Live or Peter Cook and Dudley Moore in the National Gallery. They talk about, the ducks that follow on the room rather. And that's kind of something that does happen. And you've actually created a list in the book of views or landmarks that you couldn't rid yourself of?
No, it was the landmarks. It was a list of edge territory things that wrecked mansions and depots for used soil, broken great heaps of broken stone. There were quite a number of things that you encounter up at the border, and it seemed that every time I approached the border, these same things: the deserted hospital, the school that was no longer functioning, the distribution depot for milk that was battered and nobody could get into, the abandoned quarry. All of these would reappear as if they were a signature that you were approaching the border.
And they're not easy things to walk through or around, are they? I mean, quite a lot of these spaces are vast, aren't they?
Indeed. But there is that slightly odd experience that Cardiff is has got a ridge of hills to the north. And as you traverse the ridge of hills, you're going to be travelling for, 15 miles in a thinly bending arc. And you're looking all the time, if you look seaward, you're looking to the same area and you're looking at the same thing. So it's as if as you go round, everywhere where you emerge and you look down to the sea, you see the same thing. And it doesn't matter where you are on the border, that same thing will appear. In Cardiff's case, it used to be the white sides of a flour mill in the centre of the docks, which, since that's been demolished, it's now the church on the top of the Penarth headland. And everywhere you go, you see it. It follows you round in the same way those eyes do in the National Gallery.
Well, I don't know. Oh, Anne-Marie, who posted a question, you posted a couple of questions. Anne-Marie, would you like to So
Yeah, thank you, Andrew and Peter, for fascinating talk, and I'll be getting the book, so it sounds great.
Good, excellent.
The first of my two questions you sort of answered, which was like whether you came across any features in the landscape that sort of marked it out as borderlands, and you were talking about the abandoned hospitals and the piles of spoil and quarries and that sort of thing. But the second question, I suppose, was something that came from my reading of like the Situationists and their psychogeography, and it was it was this idea that they talked about of crossing different zones, and this feeling that you could feel crossing the zones, and that there were energies that would either repel you from entering certain zones or draw you into certain zones. And I wondered if you had any of those sort of experiences when you were walking along. I mean, did you feel that the border was trying to keep you in, or repel you in some way, or some other feeling about the sort of energies there?
It's interesting the way these things, you read about them in your discovery of the Situationists and their theories about this. And does that mean that we are now looking for this, and when we see something we identify it as that, when perhaps it isn't? I don't know. But I am pretty much a believer in that there are certainly zones, and some of the areas along the southern coast of Cardiff, where you appear to be walking among the trees with the sea to your side, with the city hidden behind a treescape, and actually there is some sort of industrial something or other going on there, the breaking down of rock in some way to turn it into some other sort of roadstone or hardcore or something like that on a large industrial scale. And suddenly that takes over, and there will be a section of coast which is kind of made oppressive by this, and something doesn't feel right about it. And then suddenly you'll cross a line and it will be relieved. And you can look down and think, well, there it is. I'll put a mark on the floor because this is the place at which the zone changes. And that seems to hold. And it's not just with me, because I've taken other people with me. I took a writer friend, Des Barry, who lives in Australia now, and he made a film of it, and he called it The Zone. And it was exactly that experience that he said, it's better here than it is there. A space of a couple of feet, and that was the end of the zone, and he was pointing to the right place. And you think, am I in a Doctor Who episode? Is this something fictional, or is this real? But since he'd had the same experience as I had, it's going to be bound up with this spiritual thing that we were talking about with Bob earlier. It's got to be bound up with that, and it's something that I think is at the core of psychogeographic writing, if you call what you're writing is psychogeographic. And when I began, I thought I knew what that meant. I don't think I do now.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's interesting because I've had that experience as well, and I've tried to explain it to other people, and some people get it, and other people think, oh, it's all in your imagination. So yeah. But
if it's in two imaginations,
yes,
independently, then there's something going on, isn't there?
Yeah,
I would say.
Yeah.
Okay, has anyone got any other questions? Because we're getting quite close to the time when we could draw things to a close, and I don't want to stop any by chipping in again. I can keep going for ages, but I'm sure there are other people in the room, and you don't need to type them in the chat. You can jump in, unmute yourself, and make a declaration if you wish. Please. Do that. I might not see you. I might not see you on the screen. So, you actually need to say something. It's probably the better way of doing it. In the meantime, one thing, Peter, that I think is quite key is that is Cardiff, like, being a capital city, has had to, make a big effort about trying to win big projects. And to try to establish itself as the sort of modern, thriving capital city. And of course, we all sort of think of the barrage or the Millennium Stadium or whatever other items have cropped up in Cardiff that have gone on. and what you write about in the book is almost how this has been going on over time a lot, because Cardiff has been the capital for a while, and almost it's almost losing human scale, and I think you've sort of hinted at that a little bit on what you encountered on the borders as well.
I wouldn't go as far as to say human scale. This is the boosterism thing. This is the business that capital cities will gain things and they will be fighting above their weight in terms of the number of projects that they attract rather than being spread out, so they get clustered in the same place. And Cardiff, compared to anywhere else in Wales, has had a fair number of these. This is all true. The counter to that is that while it's been pretty good at getting many millions of pounds to set up the Cardiff Bay Barrage, which was an absolutely revolutionary structure, which is walked across in the book, I may add, and discussed at length, because there's lots of things to say about that. But while it's been pretty good at doing that, what it's been pretty bad at is the fact that it's just wiped away lots of pieces of its history. If you go around the city of Cardiff, you will find very few things that predate the Victorian era. And that's saying something. So Cardiff is Victorian with Edwardian on top of that. Those were the times of development. Yes, we've got a castle. We've got a medieval castle. We've got two medieval castles. We've got a medieval church. After that, we've run out of medieval things to acknowledge. And that wiping away of our history has carried on with the developments. The developments come in, they're great for the city, so the past has to go. So suddenly the shape of the city changes. And I did, as a survey, to try and find out a little bit more about how and what people thought of the city, went along the centre shopping street, talking to people that I bumped into, people I didn't know, people who looked like they had recently arrived here, students, for example, and talked to them about their thoughts about how near the sea Cardiff was. Is Cardiff a port? And there were quite a number who were not aware that Cardiff was a seaport, that it had once traded a fantastic amount by water. They were barely aware we were on the sea at all. And this is because the past had been wiped and people lead their lives in very different ways. And the old structures were not there and they couldn't see the remains of anything. And they came to different conclusions.
I'm going to hand over to Peter to have the last word, but I want to just say a big thank you to Peter, because that's been a great session. And also, I very much enjoyed reading the book, and I'm looking forward to reading others of yours. So thank you for that. And a big thank you to everyone who came along to the salon.
Thank you all for attending. I hope you found this informative. I hope if you found it informative and interesting enough and possibly amusing enough to try your hand at the book, which I hope is an entertaining read. Reaction from those who've read it so far says that it is. So really, and it's not that expensive. It's a big book that you get a fair bit of value for your money here. And it's got some lovely coloured maps in the back. So go for it. Edging the City. Diolch yn fawr iawn. A nos da pob un ohonych chi.
Brilliant. Thanks very much then, Peter. And everyone have a good evening, wherever you are. Good morning for some of you. And we'll be in touch with Nikki and Adam to send them their ebooks. Thanks to Seren for that. All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks. Cheers.